Ever since the beginning of 2020, I've been on a mission to beat 100 video games every single year, and immediately after finishing each game, I rank it among every other game I've beaten, not by objective quality or historical importance, but simply based on how happy it made me personally. So now that October is over, it's time to look back at the 8 games I completed this month and tell you where they landed on the rankings and why. So let's get started with number 8, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Let me start by saying that while I've never played this before, I am fully aware that the gaming world regards this as one of the best video games of all time, if not the best, but I straight up hated every minute of it. Now, I'm not stupid or self-important enough to believe that everyone else is wrong, so I recognize this has to be a me problem. The sad truth is that I'm simply not patient enough to enjoy this type of game, and that was true when I was a kid and this was new, which is why I played the first 2 hours of everything back then and never beat anything. Even without considering nostalgia, I totally understand how someone who got through this entire game on their own and experienced that level of satisfaction could see this as the best game ever. But I would never have made it even past the halfway point as a kid, and the resulting frustration of not knowing how to proceed, coupled with the god-awful controls and camera, made for an extremely rough time. I really wanted to finish this, so I just forced myself through it even though I wasn't having any fun, and that made for one of the most depressing gaming experiences of my entire life. Next up at number 7, it's Fear the Spotlight. We've seen a metric ton of these de-resed PS1-style horror games recently, and this isn't the best one I've played, but it's far from the worst. There's something you should know going into this, and it's critical, so I don't consider it a spoiler. There are 2 totally independent campaigns hidden within this single game. The initial campaign is decent, the story is mysterious and compelling, the run-and-hide gameplay is solid, and the art style is probably the best I've seen of this type. It only takes a couple hours to finish, and when it was over, I was thinking that if it was a browser game or one of those 99-cent Steam games, it would be one of the best around, but the $20 price tag is a bit much. But then you unlock a completely separate second campaign, and this thing is way scarier than the first game and therefore way better in my opinion. It's got the same cool visuals and similar puzzle solving, which I thought was kinda mid in both games, but with a completely different setting and a horrifying new villain. It was an odd choice to lock the best part of the game behind the first playthrough, but if you take both into account, I'd say it's almost worth 20 bucks, maybe pick it up on sale. Jumping up to number 6, we have Hyper Light Drifter. I dove into this knowing absolutely nothing about it other than that I heard it was good, and I agree that it definitely is, but I also have a few grievances. There's a lot about this indie title that was probably a lot more novel in 2016 when it was released. The retro art gore that was later popularized by Blasphemous, the non-linear format that Breath of the Wild made commonplace, and the minimalistic storytelling that has been run into the ground by Souls-likes. That being said, the combat, while simple, was pretty excellent, and the boss fights, while a bit janky, were certainly enough of a challenge to keep me coming back for more. The level design was intricate, but kind of to a fault. It was extremely easy to get lost because the map is more of a gentle indicator than an actual tool. And some of the paths leading to just the basic requirements to move forward were hidden so well that you'd think they were optional secrets, to the point that I had to use a walkthrough a couple of times, which I hate. I probably would have liked Hyper Light Drifter a lot more if I'd played through it when it was new, but it still holds up as an all-around decent time in 2024. Heading into the top 5 now, let's talk about A Quiet Place: The Road Ahead. When it comes to survival horror, my preferences have always aligned with the more traditional Resident Evil-style combat-heavy format, but among the run-and-hide subgenre, this definitely brings something interesting to the table. This is the first time I've ever played a game that actively listens to your mic and punishes you for making noise in real life, and just the priceless jump scares that came along with that were worth the price of admission. You'd think a simple premise like Just Be Silent would get stale rather quickly, but throughout the campaign, you're continually introduced to new obstacles and mechanics that manage to keep things pretty fresh. I did have one specific complaint, and it's kind of a biggie. This isn't like Alien Isolation, where you know the enemy is actually rendered in the environment somewhere and you're constantly dreading rounding a corner and running directly into it. Usually the game operates on a 3-strike rule, 3 sufficiently noisy mistakes within a certain time frame, and suddenly the monster just appears in a cutscene and kills you, so that was a bit formulaic and not quite as intense. But A Quiet Place: The Road Ahead overall is not lacking in the intensity department, and if you enjoy those helpless horror games, this should absolutely be on your to-do list. Just above that at number 4 is Life is Strange Double Exposure. For me, the Life is Strange games have been everything from borderline masterpiece to bland and forgettable, so where did Double Exposure fall? Well, it depends on when you're asking. If you asked me after Chapter 1, I would have said it was slower than usual and lacked the weight of the other entries, but then things started to pick up really quick. Everything between the beginning and the end was fantastic. The story is the craziest one yet, the characters are all very deep and relatable, and the motion capture and voice acting are top tier. But then at the 11th hour, Deck 9 9 does what they do and fumbles the ball at the 1-yard line, taking what is up to that point a seriously engrossing plot and tacking on a messy, confusing, and just very beige ending. For those who aren't aware, Don't Nod Entertainment made Life is Strange 1 and 2, and these are both fantastic in my opinion. But all the others, including this one, are made by Deck 9, and while each one has been better than the last, they never fully lived up to the standards set by the original developers. Double Exposure is still absolutely worth playing for the mostly good story if you're a fan of the series, but don't expect anything quite up to the level of the mainline installments. Moving on to number 3, we've got Call of Duty Black Ops 6. I've been a big fan of these campaigns every single year for almost a decade now, and Black Ops 6 isn't perfect, but it sets itself apart by being very much its own thing. The Black Ops campaigns are always a little weirder than usual, but this new installment goes more off the rails than ever by throwing in some supernatural horror, open world action, and even a little platforming. Call of Duty still provides the most realistic gun combat on the market, but since Treyarch hasn't updated their engine much recently, it's not quite as impressive or immersive as it used to be. Now, a lot of people hated on Modern Warfare 3 for being too short, but that one took me over 9 hours on Veteran, and this only took me 8, probably because it felt a little bit easier than I'm used to on that setting. But the one thing that really pissed me off was that the game kept crashing due to server issues, which is understandable on launch day, but absolutely should not be a problem during a single-player story. All in all, I still love this new campaign, even slightly more than Infinite Warfare and Cold War, but not quite as much as any of the Modern Warfare reboots. I know, come at me. Just falling short of the number 1 spot this month is Stellar Blade at number 2. I wasn't able to play this at launch, which was fine because it didn't seem like the type of game I would fall in love with, but I can tell you now that I am in love, and not just because of butts and booba. About halfway through, I was thinking everything in the game was very good, but nothing about it was truly excellent except for the amazing graphics. But then several things started to change. Not all of them were good, like the increased focus on platforming challenges with what I thought were wonky, imprecise traversal controls. But there was also a steady increase in the combat variety that made things more and more fun the deeper I got into the campaign. You just keep unlocking different kinds of abilities throughout the runtime until you have what feels like dozens of options at your disposal, and they all work together beautifully. The story got significantly more interesting toward the end, and while the first several bosses were pretty easy, the later bosses are among the hardest I've ever faced, and that always gets me excited. By the time the credits rolled, the stuff I fell in love with easily outweighed my criticisms, and while it wasn't perfect, I eventually came to decide that it was one of my very favorite games ever. And finally, my favorite game that I beat in the month of October is none other than the Silent Hill 2 remake. The survival horror genre is one of my very favorites, but even among the all-time greats like Resident Evil, Dead Space, and The Evil Within, this remake is going to go down in history for me. I was worried that Bloober Team would drop the ball in so many ways, but pretty much everything about this reimagining is flawless, starting with how downright terrifying it is. The original trilogy is the GOAT when it comes to sound and lighting design, and now it gets even scarier by employing bizarre sound effects among the silence and minimal light to induce paralyzing claustrophobia. I thought there was no way to translate this combat into the modern age, but tight controls paired with alarmingly clever enemy AI made every single encounter a harrowing fight for survival. The developers seemed to know exactly what shouldn't be touched and what needed to go bigger and better, like the huge expanded explorable areas and the extremely inventive takes on the boss fights. These games are at their very best when you're carefully making your way through the levels, using your map, checking every corner for health and ammo, and this remake just nails that whole vibe. My hope was that Bloober Team would do a respectable job for this franchise, but what we got was so far beyond my expectations that it completely blew me away. Well, that wraps up the month of October, and it brings us to a grand total of 96 games beaten so far in 2024, and a grand total of 543 since we started doing all this way back at the beginning of 2020. Remember to click like if you liked the video, and next month we'll be playing Slitterhead, Metal Gear Solid 5, Stalker 2, and much more, so feel free to subscribe if you want to see what takes the top spot in November.